So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second Association for Interdisciplinary Studies virtual roundtable talk. And today's talk is on allyship and will be led by our very own Dr. Allison Upshaw.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm so glad to see everybody. So today I have Drs. Falami, Devoe and Dr. Rachel Dezendorf with us. Rachel, is that right? Did I pronounce it correctly? Close.
Close.
How does it go?
Marias Dezendorf, like you're gonna marry us. And then Dezendorf, I don't have a good cue for because I just married into the name.
Marias Dezendorf, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am coming to you in this presentation from the unceded land of the Muskogee. And I am trying to learn in my journey toward allyship to acknowledge the land on which I stand. So that is my beginning. So bear with me. Dr. Falami Devoe is a womanist scholar activist. She is a photo artist and poet with interdisciplinary interests at the intersections of race, class, gender, identity, sexuality, ethnography, and pedagogy. And Dr. Rachel Marias Dezendorf is a policy analyst with UC Berkeley's Academic Senate, focusing on courses of instruction. She is a scholar of interdisciplinarity whose research investigates organizational change and challenges hierarchical systems. And I am your host, Dr. Allison Upshaw. I am an arts-based interdisciplinarian and co-founder of an inclusion, diversity, equity, and access facilitation group called Planning Diversity, which you can find at planningdiversity.com. I'd like to start off this conversation with a particular framework, the framework of a proverb. And that proverb says that as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And what I hope that all of us will take away from this conversation is a sharpening of our thoughts and our actions around allyship and our ability to build a like-minded community that we can travel together along this journey with. Okay, so let's jump right in. Dr. Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz speaks of an archaeology of self when it comes to allyship. And so my first question for our guest today is, how might that phrase, that archaeology of self, be applied to anyone that is on a journey to becoming an ally? Who would like to start?
Well, I guess I will start first. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, first of all, Allison. And I too acknowledge the land in which I sit and work on and live on here in the Muskogee as well. So I give honor and gratitude to those people that lived on this land before I did. So thank you. So to answer your question, wow, that's a wonderful question. I love the notion of archaeology of self. And when I heard this notion, of course I've been thinking, archaeologists, what do archaeologists do, right? And I immediately thought about the unearthing, right? The unearthing. And that for me, in thinking about this notion of archaeology of self, is unearthing ideas, that we have been accustomed to, ideologies, socialized ideologies that we have been accustomed to, and tangling with those ideologies and those biases and those stereotypes that we are been accustomed to, and as well as thinking about the whole system of digging deeply into race and racism. And so, you know, I really love that analogy of archaeology of self, because I immediately came, you know, this word unearthing, because then it put a visual in my mind. And as an artist, I'm a visual. And so I needed to see it so that it will hopefully stick. So that's what I think of in that notion of archaeology of self and allyship, because it's important that those who are allies, those who want to become allies, unearth that stuff and get to the root, if you will, of understanding and seeking to understand issues of oppression, systems, right? Systemic racism. And so that is what resonates with me when I think of that.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
I had a similar, and then my thought deviated a little bit from Dr. Things. Oh, sorry, I just got a weird notification. And when I was thinking about kind of this archaeology of the self, I was thinking about peeling away, like when you're digging and you're slowly brushing away the dirt, you're brushing away kind of the society from the self, of understanding what is it that was compacted around the individual to make that person stand up to who they are. And for me, I always think about one, schooling, as well as education, and separating those two ideas. Because that's something I now consciously try to do. Because a lot of how I think of like, oh, well, I was educated at this institution, and recognizing I went to school, I learned one set of rules, and then also there's the societal things that I was educated about there. And so I went to a lot of land grant universities, and I was always very proud of that, of look at me, of like public institutions, like focus on the people. And it wasn't until very recently where I was actually forced to think about the land that was granted, and how it was not but a benevolent system like it's depicted, and thinking about what does it mean for me to be proud of something, that a system that presents itself as benevolent but has a racist history, and thinking about what does that mean, is it building up of myself and pulling that away.
Very interesting. So I have been thinking about it one way, but before I get to that, Rachel, your visual of brushing away just brought up to me that when archaeologists dig, they dig very carefully. Because they don't want to break anything. There are stories to be told and what they're finding. And so if you rush through the process, you damage whatever it is that you're trying to uncover. And I think sometimes when you are a part of the marginalized group, you want people to get to the point where they understand quickly. And we don't always acknowledge that there needs sometimes to be a careful brushing off, because there are things that will be damaged that are good, along with the things that have to be pulled up by the root. So there's that part that we need to talk about and think about in our journey, right? Is how we can gently and carefully excavate, because some of it, my friend is doing a book called Grandmama Sayings, and one of the grandma sayings is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so that whole idea of not throwing out the good with that which needs to be thrown away. But my original idea was was a difference between accepting and supporting. So when I dig deep, I needed to understand the difference between accepting something and supporting something for me in terms of what allyship looked like. And I got this cute little analogy from TikTok. So the lady was talking about football, and I understand that because I'm in a football town, or an American football town for those of you who are not American. And this game, there are teams that I kind of like them. I watch them if they play. I'll flip the channel and say, oh yeah, they're on TV. I'll watch them. I accept them as a team and I'll root for them. But then there are the teams whose paraphernalia I buy, whose tickets that I will pay for, whose games I will travel long distance to go to. Now those teams I support, right? To the extreme of anything else. And I have to dig and find out where my allyship lies in terms of supporting the marginalized groups, to the extent that I am committed to supporting them financially or with my time or with my energy, or am I at the acceptance level where I'm just kind of, yeah, wow, that's not a good thing, or I accept that something needs to be done, but I haven't actually committed to doing it. And I have to excavate and find out where I lie in that acceptance to support continuum. So that's what I was thinking about.
I like that. I like that. I want to go back to the brushing away again. The brushing, I like that as well. The visuals, I'm all about the visuals. And then I was thinking, sitting here, as we're brushing away, what is, what are the motions or feelings that are going as we are continuing to brush? Is it anticipation? Is it fear? What are those feelings that, as we're, the ally is brushing away at the source of what they're trying to seek, as we're still trying to go with this analogy? I'm just thinking about the emotions and feelings that are attached with that cannot be devoid of the action, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's all. That's what I was thinking.
But I like that. I've had a conversation where we were talking about, I'm in the South, and we have a history of traditions that, God help you if you mess with our traditions, and there's something about the first time that you have to acknowledge that those traditions don't really stand the test of time. Like what you were saying, Rachel, about the land grant, and having to acknowledge that it's not as benevolent as it sounds on the surface. And, some of the traditions that we have, I'll never forget, in one of my early doc program classes, this young lady from Mississippi was talking about her grandparents' home and how she loved to play, and her grandparents were just so cool that they even had an outdoor bathroom for them, that they didn't even have to come in the house, they could just run and play and do blah blah blah. And how old she was when she realized that her very loving, very caring grandparents didn't allow the Black help to use the bathroom in the house, and that generous outside bathroom was really for the Black help. And how the stories that she would tell and the vision that she'd had of her grandmother and grandfather were very different probably than the stories that the workers, the people that worked for them, would tell, and other Black people, and how, she had to learn to journey past her heritage, journey past the traditions of her family to become an ally, and to be able to even go back home and say, Grandma, Grandpa, that was wrong. And I don't know about y'all, but there are things I still don't tell my mother she's wrong about. That it takes a certain type of courage to stand up to your parents or your grandparents, the people you love, and say, that's wrong. I love you, but that's wrong.
I think also a part of that, about the moment of, you're saying, when your friend, when she grew up and realized what it was, about how would have that been different if she realized it when she was younger? Like, her willingness to go to her grandparents and say this is not okay was probably somewhat informed by her age. I can think about, I must have been in high school. My aunt said something at a dinner table that was pretty racist, and I don't remember how I talked back, but I know I talked back and then stormed out of the room. And then I was lectured by my grandmother about being disrespectful to my elders. She said, you are totally right. She said, like, I was right in saying what was said was wrong. She's like, but there's a way you do it, and you did it wrong. It was very disrespectful. And I think, to this day, when my aunt says racist things, I think about that, of how am I going to be able to say that's wrong without then upsetting the rest of my family for being disrespectful? when they can acknowledge what my aunt's saying is wrong, but that finding the right way with the right maturity to navigate those relationships.
Yes, that is a challenge. That is definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
And sometimes we end up missing the message because we focus on the messenger,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and how the message was given or something to that effect. So another question that I had was the idea, there's a South African principle called Ubuntu. And it translates into I am because we are. And how does that concept, or how can we apply that concept to this idea of allyship? I am because we are.
So if you like, I can start. So this phrase, I had to Google it because I wasn't familiar with it before. And reading about it reminded me of teaching that I learned growing up out of Judaism of, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And part of it reminded me of the way the sentence is structured, reminded me of this understanding of being an individual with being with a community and how those things have to balance out. And the phrase itself of I am because we are, thinking about I can only exist when we work together, but we cannot exist if I'm not okay. That understanding of I can be an ally for the group, but I still need to be able to take care of myself. And if I'm not taking care of myself, I can't contribute to the group. And that understanding, kind of thinking about boundaries of allyship, of where am I willing to set a boundary saying, I cannot do this for you until I've done something for myself. And whether it's like something physical, like some mental space, that knowing that I can't contribute to a larger allied community if I'm not acknowledging what I need personally as an ally.
Powerful.
Yeah, I actually love that, Rachel. When I'm familiar with the South African principle, and originally I did not think to consider that principle in allyship. And because I sat back and I said, okay, let me really process this and how it does relate. And then I said, yes, we are connected, and being connected to each other and having to have a cause to come together that brings us together, and it does become I am and we are. So I had to kind of break it down. And then I'm going to take this way back here, Allison. So excuse me. You said this is all about conversation. So, you know, I had to process this. My background is journalism and grammar. And so I started thinking about I think it was a lecture company or Zoom or maybe it was even Sesame Street. I can't remember. But I don't know if you remember when they were trying to teach children to put sentences together. There would be a word that would come into the left of the screen, another word that would come into the right of the screen, and then they'll drop, a phrase in between. You put these words together to make a wonderful sentence, right? So I said, okay, what if we took apart that principle, I am because we are, and inserted some words. So I started playing with this, because I'm visual. Remember, I'm visual, and I like to write these words down. And I said, I am, and then I want those of you who are listening, what would you insert there in terms of allyship? What phrase or word would you insert? So I said, I am able to have hope in my ally because we are working to disrupt systems of oppression. So I thought about making it like a new word principle, if you will, by inserting new phrases, new words to really bring it to home for me what allyship is. So I broke it apart. I am And what would you add in there, in between there? Because we are, and what do you want to add into that or add to that to represent what allyship is and relating to that South African principle? So that's my little visual, my breaking down this complex. I originally thought that no, but then I started thinking more and I said, yeah, if we think about this a little bit, just tweaking it just a little bit differently, and what do we want to put in there that would represent what allyship is? Does that make sense?
I like that. I was, I guess when I thought about it, I thought, what's that poem by Niemöller? At first they came for the Jews.
Yes.
I was not a Jew. I said nothing. It's like, how many times have people come for a group and no one has said anything? But what happens to the least happens to me. If there are people who are homeless in some way, that affects me. When there are people whose rights are being trampled, that affects me. There's a piece that I do, an art piece that I use to lead questions, facilitate work around allyship. And there's a phrase in it that says, what hurts you murders me and eventually marks your grave. It hurts you, it murders me, but my death marks your grave. We're all in this thing together. And the least thing, the pain of one, should impact me in some way. It does impact me, even if I don't see it. The injustices of the LGBTQ community affect me. I don't belong to that community, but it impacts me, and it should. It should, because we're in this together. I can only get so far by myself. Like, everybody is in this together, and how do we find that common thread? I think sometimes we're so busy looking for the differences that we forget to find the similarities, that we're all human, and that what hurts one hurts someone else. I mean, that we have to talk about those similarities, and even as we talk about our differences and celebrate our differences, that we also ought to celebrate and talk about our similarities as well.
So I think when you're talking about what hurts me would murder someone else, that I think it's really easy for people of non-marginalized identities to ignore it, of just like, I'm fine. I'm not being hurt. It's not a big deal. And that the ability to acknowledge that someone else's pain is your pain as well requires that archaeology of the self, requires the self-work that's necessary for being an ally. That it's not just going out and protesting and saying and donating money, that there's a lot of looking at yourself and saying, am I willing to experience the hurt of others? And if you're not willing to experience that, there's that love. It's a part of the experience of being an ally that it's easy to avoid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to get through at least 2 more questions before we open it up to the floor. We maybe, because I love to talk, I know it. But one of the things we've been talking about a lot is that belonging, the idea of cost, and of making decisions on the cost of what it is to be an ally, or the cost of what it means to belong to a marginalized group, right? So the word ally comes from the Latin word alligare, and it means to bind, right? To bind to, and that's not to bind myself to someone. It's not the same thing as grabbing them by the pinky finger and holding on, and it's a different kind of connection there, right? But to be a true ally, I feel that there's a cost, not a monetary cost, but there's cost involved. And so we started talking about this a little bit earlier, but have you decided the costs at which you are willing or unwilling to live in allyship. For instance, I was trying to think of a visual or a way to think of this. So some people are allies at the certificate level. They're reading all the books. They're learning all they can gather the information, and that's where they are right now on their journey to allyship. Some people have made it to the bronze level, where they are, say, willing to confront a family member at dinner and risk the cost of not being invited back to Thanksgiving, right? Some people have made it to, say, a silver level, where they're willing to speak up at the faculty meeting when they see unfair practices. They're willing to risk the cost of a promotion or the goodwill of the department chair in order to speak up for someone in their department. Some people are willing to put themselves more on, physically put themselves out into marches, and they are willing to be arrested and to demonstrate their allyship in that way. Everybody can't or won't or doesn't enter their allyship journey at the same level, right? So I'm asking you, have you counted a cost, and have you decided, because what I think is important is to make some of these important decisions before you have to. Before there's the promotion on the line and something happens in the meeting and you have to decide right on the spot, am I going to speak up and risk that promotion that I've been fighting for 2 years in order to say that that's wrong? Am I going to risk that? But if I make that decision beforehand, before that comes up, then I can rest in what I've already decided is, where I'm willing to accept cost. So I'm asking, have either of you counted cost?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have counted cost, and what it came down to is, one, how am I being true to my authentic self? So knowing who I am and what I'm willing to do. I said, yes, there are certain things that I will not do because it goes against who I am and just my being. So yes, that's so important to think about it beforehand, before you get in the midst of the fire and say, oh, what am I going to do? No, if you already know that this is what you're going to do, and it's within your authenticity, you being who you are, then you're okay. I have had a situation where, particularly, there was a circumstance where I could have gone to a march and participated in a march. I chose not to. That's not my form of allyship. That's not my way that I wanted to participate due to health reasons. And so I knew what I could do, and I chose to speak out in a way. I chose to create, this is a whole long story, but I chose to create these self-care boxes for those activists that were on the front lines. That was my allyship. That was the way, because I believe all of us have something that we can do in a form of allyship, either it be either at the certificate level, as you say, Allison, or at the gold level. It just depends on what that is. And then talking about authentic self, for me, it's important that I use my voice and share and call people in. And this is common now. This term of calling people in versus calling people out. Mm-hmm. And that is what I choose to do. And so that's how I have kind of wrestled or settled with this whole notion of the cost that I'm willing to take.
So I was thinking about if there are some causes that I am a certificate ally and other causes that I'm somewhere else in that spectrum. And it's acknowledging for me if there's some causes that I am more willing to be a more, I guess, active ally would be the word. And other causes that, one, it's a mixture of I can't be everything to everyone. And so I need to acknowledge I have to pick the things that I'm going to value over others. And not that those other things aren't important, but I can only do so much as a single person. So it's one, acknowledging like, I'm going to have to make choices, and those choices might change over the course of my life. Like it might vary, and it could based on a lot of things. But thinking about like what are the costs that I'm willing to pay was something I never had to. It's something I chose to not actively think about in the present until this summer. I think it was a lot of. Like in school, it was a lot of like, oh, if you were alive during the civil rights movement, what would have you done? All in the past tense, not what are you willing to do now for the current struggle? And it wasn't this summer that I was like, what am I willing to put on the line this summer? And it was looking at my husband and realizing I'm making decisions that affect both of us. It's not just me anymore. And I'm willing to go to protests. For those who have not met me, I am very short. And I was like, that can be an advantage in this situation, that I am confident the police officer won't hit me because I'm a small white lady. Like, I'd be willing to step up to the police in this protest, but I'm not willing to get arrested. That's where I drew the line. And so there was a point where the curfew was called. My husband and I went home, and our friend texted us, I'm staying out. We're going to break curfew. And I looked at him and said, so how many people is she with? And how much bail can we afford? Like, we know we can afford to bail your one friend out. We can probably bail her boyfriend out. How much? And that was a real physical cost of like, it was the first time it was like, I'm going to put money on the line here. This isn't just, what would I have done? It's like, no, this tomorrow morning, what are we doing? And we were very lucky that the curfew wasn't really enforced. So it was a different issue of the curfew should never have been in place in the first place. But it was something that was thinking about, it would have been easier to have that conversation if we thought about it before the moment it needed to happen. That we were making this decision of what is the cost in the moment of, are we putting money on the line now? And it was a difficult conversation to have, especially when it was connected with someone we love, of where are we in that allyship?
I had that same in the moment realization. I want to get to this last question, and so I'll hurry through this, but I made a decision to demonstrate, to wear something, to wear a shirt that I felt demonstrated my allyship, and I was so proud of myself. I'm like, okay, I'm ready, And then I realized as I was walking out, and I got looks for what I was wearing, that what I was wearing meant something different to other people. Like, this was the first time that I had this negative reaction directed at me. And I realized I have a responsibility to get home to my 90-year-old mother. And this could be physically an altercation, because people were very heated at the time around this particular thing. And I thought, I'm making a decision, or I have made a decision, that I really hadn't counted the cost. Because if someone had physically attacked me because of what they thought I would truly meant behind this, without ever having a conversation with me or everything, I might not make it home. And that was unacceptable. That was an unacceptable cost for me. And I came home, and I really had to start thinking about, again, doing that archaeology of self and brushing away and saying, okay, what cost am I willing to pay? And I didn't like all of my answers, but I started finding some of those answers, whether I like them or not. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And this is the last question I have.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm just thinking, I'm wondering, you know, our young allies, and I'm saying our young allies, is this a more mature kind of conversation in terms of things? I'm wondering if our young allies have these same, thought processes as they're getting involved in becoming allies. What are your thoughts about that? I'm wondering, and I don't want to sound ageist or anything, but I'm just wondering if because I don't know. What do you think, Rachel?
So I have a couple thoughts. First, I think these conversations happen, and I think that the way I think students, young people engage with them is always age appropriate, if that makes sense. So they may not use the same language we use, but I think the heart of the conversation is there.
Okay.
Thinking about a more concrete example. So the protest I went to where I had this conversation with my husband of what are we willing to do was organized by high school students. Over 10,000 people showed up.
Wow.
Wow.
So like talk about like I was
Yeah.
there, like, we couldn't hear speeches because we were too far away. Like also COVID, so we didn't want to be close to anyone, even though we had all of our masks on. And I'm just there like crying because I'm like, these high school students, they're gonna do it. Like
Yes.
feeling all the feelings. And my husband's there like, oh my God, Rachel, get it together. I feel all the feelings all the time. So I think that it's one of those things of do I think a high schooler could sit and have this conversation with us?
Mhm.
Not in these words. I
Right.
think that if we changed the way we talked about it, they could totally engage in this conversation. And I think I find that hopeful of like, read a couple more books so your vocabulary grows a little and we're still having the same conversation.
And the reason why I asked that, because I'm so interested in intergenerational conversations. And as these need for movements to happen in order for society to move forward, it's a wonderful way to entertain that idea of having intergenerational conversations so that we can learn from them and they can learn from us and how we can support, our movements, right? So that's what I was thinking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So guys, it's about almost 20 till, and I wanted to make sure that I know time is just flying. So I wanted to make sure that people had an opportunity. Khadija, could you help me out? Are there questions in the chat because I haven't really been paying a lot of attention to the chat. Would you mind sharing some of those with us?
Sure. So I'm going to go in the order of how folks posted. And so the first question comes from Jen, and she asked, how does one or can one intervene as an ally?
May I jump in just a sec to clarify that?
Sure.
You hear me? So that was in response to what Rachel was saying about telling her relative off at the dinner table and then being told that she wasn't respectful. And I think the dialogue in the United States right now is very shrill. And if you say you disrespected your relative, you kind of can get back, well, light them on fire. They deserve it. Burn the house down. But is that really getting us to the place where we want to go? So that made me start thinking about how do we think about intervention, right? Not instructions for intervening in particular situations, but how do we think about intervention?
I know for me, it's really hard because there's part of me that says that it seems we've lost the place of civility, right? So there's not a civil talking to. People don't have civil conversations anymore. It's always, you did this and you did that. But I can just speak for myself. If you calling me out my name, I am not interested in hearing anything you have to say. If you're talking to me in a certain tone of voice, I'm not hearing you. I think we've gotten past the point where we're trying to make change, and that what we are really doing is just speaking to hear ourselves being heard. We're just speaking out loud just to hear the sound of our voice, because we're really not actually trying to make any change, because surely we can't make change when we are talking, when we're calling people out of their name and or talking about them in ways that are not, that don't have any basic respect for anyone. I just don't see how that will, I just don't see how that changes anything. That's, that's just from my perspective off the top of my head.
So I want to go back to the point that I made about calling in. And calling in, and I'm looking right now, calling in is a phrase that Loretta Ross, she's a activist, has used. So I'm going to drop this information in the chat that might be helpful as a way to engage in having those conversations, to call people in without tearing them down, without breaking them down, and calling them out and shaming them. So that's my suggestion or recommendation in terms of, intervening and calling people in. So I'm going to put this information in the chat.
Well, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I read something recently about sorry, Khadijah.
Go ahead. I was going to go to the next question, but go ahead.
So this is something I struggle with. I am very much of I'm dismissive of people when they say offensive things, of they can't be reached, they're gone, there's no point in engaging. That's very much where I end up, of like, why bother wasting my time trying to call someone in when the best I can do is call them out? Like, why would I waste my time with this? And I was told recently I should work with finding common definitions of when I go and say, like for an example that was given to me was, I would want to call someone a racist. And they go, oh, but I'm not a racist. And it's like, well, we should clarify what we mean by that term, because we're talking past each other. We're using the same word, but we're not speaking the same language. And that's keeping us from actually having a conversation about behavior and the words we choose to use. And that's kind of along the lines with like the de-escalation language of, before we get heated, let's agree on what we're talking about. I'm yet to successfully do this. I will say that.
Yeah. I love that.
Thank you. Thank you. So the second question, and I'll get within context, is from my colleague at Norfolk State, Ashley Haynes. And her question came in the chat right after there was a talking about the visual that Rachel provided. So her question is there a visual to support the idea of figuring out where someone is on the spectrum of allyship?
I did a little digging. I found something.
Oh, that's Allison.
But I think it is lacking.
Mm-hmm.
So I just put it in the chat. But if there's something better, I sure would like to know, because I think people benefit from that interruption, and it would help with that self-archaeology. Where am I on this spectrum? And this one is lacking.
Yes, I don't know of any. I've just been talking about it in that way, and I don't know of, I haven't seen any visuals that lay it out in terms of a journey or other things that are more complete than the one that you just shared with us.
Okay. Well, then, thank you. I'll go to the next question, which also was early on in the conversation, and it's from Maciel. And he says, doesn't the work of allyship also bear a suggestion of a small band supporting each other and a fight against others? Perhaps Ubuntu warns us not to overlook the interdependencies, even with those whose unjust acts we are trying to mitigate.
I think that part of what we have to talk about is that we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We cannot afford to throw away people, even when their policies, their beliefs are hurtful and painful and dangerous. how do we have that conversation? And I think part of it is what you started talking about, Rachel, is that first of all, we have to have a common vocabulary. Everybody's screaming out racist, and everything isn't racist. Some things I just don't like you. Just don't like you, but that doesn't mean that it's racist. And sometimes it's not sexist. I just don't like you, or you're just not whatever, or it doesn't have to always be the ism. It can just be I don't like you.
Or you mean, I was like, sometimes people are just nasty.
Nasty, right?
Just awful people.
Yes.
You just don't like them, you
That's
know. Right. But sometimes, but that need to define what the isms are, racism, sexism, ageism, we need to know what that means, because if I know what racism is, then I understand why people say there isn't reverse racism. Mm-hmm. What we say that that we have, that sometimes I think we don't have the vocabulary. We don't have that common vocabulary that allows us to have a conversation. And that means that we have to throw people away because we can't talk. And it's because we haven't yet put in the effort to define that vocabulary. So before we have this conversation, let's pick out our words, and let's just make sure that we're on the same page, because if you're speaking German and I'm speaking French, there's going to be a lot of misunderstandings going on here, right? And we have to recognize that we're also bringing in our own intersectionalities into interpretation. So where does that leave us? And if we don't talk about that background before we get to the conversation, then it's so much easier to just throw people away.
So I found the question, because sometimes I need to read to process. I was thinking about the idea of the fight against others. And when I think about my role as an ally, I'm not fighting against other people, I'm fighting against a system. And it's understanding that, you know, people who benefit from a system, if it's a system that harms others, it harms everyone. And part of being an ally is showing those in power how they are also harmed by a system that they benefit from. And and then using that perspective, it's easier to avoid the idea of it's us versus them, because there's still a them, but that them should be part of us.
I like that.
Thank you. Thank you. We had some comments. One is from also one of my colleagues, Geoffroy de la Facard, who just said, if there's no cost to oneself, it's spectatorship. And then we had, I'm maneuvering in the questions. I think this is more of a comment. I'm trying to get questions though. I think there are a lot of comments. Okay, so here's a question. Civil conversations and de-escalation language is so important. And this links to what you just mentioned, Allison. Do you want to be right, or do we want to further understanding? And that's from Judith McKay. It's kind of a question statement.
But it's true. I think sometimes I don't think we've thought about it sometimes, because our emotions are so involved, right? That when we're in the conversation, we're all struggling to be heard. I want to be heard. I want to be heard. And it's one of those things, like, just like we're asking to count the cost before we get in a situation, that even when we get into conversations, we need to decide beforehand, what if I get in a conversation with someone who doesn't seem to like who I am, or has racist ideologies or sexist ideologies, what is going to be my purpose in engaging? And I would like to throw this example out, that when I was in grad school at LSU working on my master's, a young white lady and I, she was from Mississippi, and she was gun-toting, you know, just everything that you could think of in terms of a stereotypical white Southerner with prejudiced and racial, prejudiced racial views about Black people. And every day for 2 semesters, we had the same class schedule, and we would have breakfast together. And we talk, and we talked. And I have no idea what we talked about, but we talked. We talked about race, and we talked about sex, and we talked about music, and we talked. And I, to this day, have no idea what we talked about in that time. But some 20 years later, she is the head of voice at a predominantly Black school in Mississippi. And she said that it was our conversations that changed her perspective. And that hit me in a kind of way. 20 years later, I have no idea what I said to her, and why I think it's so important that we don't throw people away just because they have these ideas that we think are crazy or that are unappealing or are unfair or whatever. That sometimes talking, not just to be heard, but to actually give information or share information and address some of their concerns is really important.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, just the whole notion of being intentional about having a conversation, because oftentimes people choose not to and sit within their own thought processes, right? And not engage in conversation. So even just your presence of having that conversation, I mean, made the difference. And you said you don't know what it meant. It could have just been your presence, getting to know you as a human being. Getting to know you as a human being, hearing your story, getting to know you. And so I love that. Being intentional about inviting people to have conversations, those that don't look like us, those that we're not in the same neighborhood. But yeah, inviting a conversation. Absolutely.
I want to apologize. I missed a question early on in the discussion about the cost benefit. And it's from Joff, and it says the cost benefit thing is an odd calculation to bring to allyship, but the reality is it is never entirely painless to surrender privilege. The rewards are much greater. Well, a comment, and then to discuss this some more was the question. And then I want to it said, he gave 2 examples I just want to bring to everyone's attention. About how about instead of in a conversation, instead of you are a racist, do you realize that you are enabling racism? If you say you are not, can we discuss how others might have a different perspective? So I guess as we, for closing thoughts in his question in terms of privilege, allyship, I think Judith mentioned conflict resolution. That's part of what it is, right? It's you're mediating and trying to get to some common ground, perhaps, as Sven has put in the chat, several interdisciplinary theories of approaches. So that was a lot, but I guess for your closing thoughts.
Would anybody like to wrap up?
It's funny, I think there's a lot to unpack. Thinking about the cost benefit analysis of it all, and thinking about the lines I've drawn for myself. A lot of the lines are one about physical safety of my family, things like that, but also of if I decide to get arrested, is this going to affect my ability to make change in other places? Will that arrest record keep me from being involved in decision-making processes because I can't get a job that I want? That they'll look at that arrest record and go, maybe you're not for us. So it's not just when I think about the idea of holding on to some privilege, to use that privilege as an advantage. Mm-hmm. Of I want to keep my squeaky clean record because it means I could potentially be working as the second hand of a chancellor at a university. And then I'm going to have a lot of power about policies around being an anti-racist like community. And it's this like, they're not immediate cost benefit analyses. It's not like I can say it's an easy scale. It's looking at where's the privilege that I understand the benefit of giving up, and the privilege I see a benefit to holding on to outside of just like my personal benefit.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, and in particular, I want to just go back to where we began in the archaeology of self and how very important it is to examine, to do that excavating, that brushing, that deep diving, as allies enter into this space of wanting to take our hands, and whoever that is, and to work together. So it's important to continue to center that thought about the deep dive, because it's hard work to be an ally, because you have to think about your privilege, you have to think about the cost, right? And so I think it's so important to keep that in mind in this whole process of allyship, is the archaeology of self, this self-examination, and knowing that it's a journey. As you said, it's a journey through allyship. And on that journey, how do you grapple with who you were and who you're becoming as you're becoming this ally?
So I think someone wanted to make share an anecdote or something, Khadija, and then I'll have a little wrap up.
Okay. So Joff, you can share quickly, and then it'll be open to Allison.
Okay, I was just typing it out, but I want to make the point. As you can tell, I'm European. I have worked very closely in communities where I'm the only European, and there's no avoiding that being an academic is having a position of privilege in addition to everything else. So allyship really involves acknowledging it, but I've never been told by those with whom I strive to ally, get out. I've been told, we want you there. So I think in some ways, working so that your privilege, which is structural, you can't just make this statement that it's gone, right? It's something that you have to put to work for the cause, for other people, to create spaces and to empower. You know, not just do this individualistic sacrificial thing of, if I give everything up, I'm a good person. So in building community, there's becoming part of the community and making whatever strategic position you're in benefit the work that that community is doing.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Well, thank you all for coming and for sharing with us today. Really had.
Thank you.
I really feel like it's been a wonderful sense of community, even though we didn't really talk straight back and forth with you guys. I really felt a sense of support and of openness to the conversation, and I really appreciate that. One thing that I'd like you to take away is to think about this journey of allyship and what do you think is going to be essential for you to keep. But you know, when you're on a journey, it's also important what you leave behind. So when we're packing to go on a trip, what's important for you to take, but what's important for you to leave behind? Because there are things that we don't need to take with us, right? And so think about those things, and I hope that you will come to our next roundtable. I'm not sure what our topic will be yet, but our fearless leader, Khadija, will have something important and wonderful for us to share. And thank you so much again for coming. Thank you, guests, for being with us and for sharing such wonderful ideas. We really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon, everyone, or morning or night.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.